order. You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man.
The inquiry into child abuse in Northern Ireland has begun to examine what happened in Kincora Boys' Home in East Belfast. At least 29 boys were abused at the home between the late 1950s and the early 1980s. The inquiry will look at whether state agencies, including the intelligence services, knew that children were being abused and covered it up. Here's our Ireland correspondent, Chris Buckler.
The sexual abuse that took place at the Kincora Boys' Home led to a scandal. But decades later, there are persistent claims that all the secrets of this house have not been revealed, and that people in positions of power were involved in a cover-up. Today, Northern Ireland's Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry began examining whether the police, MI5 and MI6 among others, knew that boys were being groomed at Kincora and abused.
You will also hear me refer to, and you will read claims of state-sponsored child prostitution, paedophile rings, blackmail and cover-ups.
Many of the allegations relate to the 1970s, a time of violence and turmoil in Northern Ireland, when knowledge was valuable, particularly in gathering intelligence. And it's been claimed that the late William McGrath, who was one of the paedophiles who ran Kincora, was at one stage employed by MI5. Clint Massey was one of those abused by McGrath.
I firmly believe somebody up there knew and said, right, we'll let this run.
When you say the authorities, who do you mean?
MI5 and Army intelligence.
There have already been investigations and inquiries. However, many of those who were abused insist they have never revealed the full truth. Lives were scarred at Kincora, but this latest inquiry faces a significant challenge in separating the facts from years of allegations. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Belfast.
When Sir Anthony Hart's inquiry into historical abuse in Northern Ireland begins looking into the notorious Kincora Boys' Home today, one of the allegations it will be exploring is whether the intelligence services were involved in covering up what happened there from the 1950s. There's no question that children were abused at Kincora. 3 men who ran the home in East Belfast were convicted in 1981 of abusing 11 boys, but at least 29 were abused there right up to the early 1980s. We're joined now from Belfast by Clint Massey, a survivor of abuse at Kincora, and by the investigative journalist Chris Moore, who's followed the story since 1980. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Clint Massey, how long were you at Kincora?
I was in Kincora for approximately 8 months.
And how old were you when you arrived there?
I was 16.
And what happened in your time there?
From day one, I was regularly raped every morning. That was my way of getting woke up out of bed.
And your abuser was a man called William McGrath, is that right, who was later convicted?
Yeah, that's right, that was William McGrath.
And this happened throughout your time there?
Yes, that was a regular occurrence.
And were you able to tell anyone about it at the time or in the years immediately afterwards?
No. I mean, I was 16 at the time. I had a social worker who was 22 at the time. Young woman. I mean, a different era. You didn't mention things like that.
A different era, and particularly as far as Northern Ireland was concerned, a time during the Troubles where you also had the security dimension of what was happening around you.
Well, I mean, just outside the door of the home, it was on the verge of civil war at times. You know, I mean, there was armoured cars roaming the streets everywhere. So it paled into insignificance when you saw the big picture. And nobody would want to listen to somebody like myself.
Chris Moore, when did you start to learn about what had happened at Kincora and get interested in the story?
Well, the story first emerged in 1980, and it was a story about, apparently there was what was called in the newspaper that broke the story, a homosexual vice ring. And the intrigue came when the three staff were coming to trial. It emerged that one of them, William McGrath, was of particular interest because of his loyalist connections. He ran a small paramilitary group called Tara. He was involved in organising meetings in Orange halls, in unionist halls. He gave talks about the doomsday scenario, about how the IRA and republicanism was going to take over the country, and he had good connections with the unionist family. Jim Molyneux would have been a visitor to his home. He would have had meetings with Ian Paisley and Ian Paisley's church and other premises. So he went to Stormont with Ian Paisley. So this was a man who was well connected. And when he decided that he was going to face trial, he was going to deny all the charges until the last moment, and then he decided that he would plead guilty. So, in effect, there was no ventilation in the court of the facts surrounding the case.
Right, and when this starts to be looked into today by the abuse inquiry, I mean, both MI5 and MI6 have agreed to be central participants in the hearing. Is it your hope that therefore we get to the bottom of this question of whether the intelligence services were involved in covering up what happened at the time?
Well, it's quite apparent to people like Clint and other survivors of abuse at Kincora that there has been a cover-up. And the cover-up here has caused them as much pain as the physical and sexual abuse that they suffered whilst in Kincora. As regards MI5 or 6 or the Ministry of Defence coming along and taking part in this inquiry, the inquiry doesn't have any powers to compel. That's kind of worrying. These people from MI5 and from MI6 and from the Ministry of Defence have singularly not cooperated really up to now. In fact, the two original police investigations were blocked by the fact that MI5 did not produce an officer for questioning by the police on two occasions, on two separate police investigations. The first one by the RUC, the second one was by the RUC, but it was under the leadership of Sir George Terry, the then Chief Constable of Sussex.
They have agreed to be participants in this hearing. Clint Massey, what did you think at the time about the reasons for why it took so long to get to grips with what was happening? Eventually there were criminal proceedings and these three men, including your abuser, were convicted.
I think it took so long because there was people to be protected. People had to be moved out of the picture so that a type of inquiry could take part, but no real damage done to the structure of the security forces. They were still going to do what they were going to do, and we were just collateral damage, but they had their assets to protect, and they moved them out of the picture for a while.
And so you still think there is more to learn and understand about what happened at Kincora and its implications. Would it have been important to you to have this included in the Goddard inquiry?
It would be important because with the best will in the world, the Banbridge inquiry, most people couldn't point to Banbridge on a map. It is a big story in Northern Ireland, but to people in the south of England or Birmingham, it's small beer. But if it's mentioned long enough in Westminster, then people will start to ask questions about Kincora. Why is this so important? Why does this name keep on cropping up?
But Chris Moore, is it your hope that is, even if it's not part of the Goddard inquiry, that the fact that Sir Anthony Hart's inquiry is going to look into it today gives you the answers that you've been looking for?
I've got concerns about it, to be truthful. I'm not sure that it does, and I think that the survivors who now realise that for 10 years a man who was raping young men in Kincora, like Clint, William McGrath, seemed to be protected. He wasn't certainly prosecuted, and all attempts to have him prosecuted were knocked back. And the MI5 operation here made quite certain that the police and an army intelligence officer were not allowed to progress the information about what was going on inside the home and have a court case. So I think the truth is that the survivors that I've spoken to, and Clint's here, so I think what they really wanted was an inquiry. The Goddard inquiry would have the powers to compel people to come forward, and I think that is still in their minds as being necessary.
Chris Moore and Clint Massey, thank you both.